Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, a special two-part episode for you. Hey, it's March. The Big Ten tournament is here. It is time to pull out all the stops. So we have Adam Jardy, who covers Ohio State basketball for the Columbus Dispatch. We had him on before the season to talk about the Buckeyes. We will have him on now to reflect on that first game that Indiana and Ohio State played in Bloomington, what has changed for the two teams since, the impact of Caleb Wesson's return, and what he expects to occur on Thursday, and if this is kind of a play-in game for these two teams. We'll get his thoughts on that. And then joining us after the conversation with Adam is Jess Settles, a name that you surely know well if you are a Big Ten basketball fan of a certain age. He played for the Iowa Hawkeyes back in the mid-90s, one of the best players in the Big Ten at the time, and has turned into one of the best commentators, now calling Big Ten basketball games for BTN. He was on the call for the IU-Rutgers game. He's called a few Indiana games this season. We'll get his thoughts on what he saw Sunday against Rutgers, what he has seen from Indiana this season, what he expects from the Hoosiers moving forward, and, of course, reflect a little bit on his career as a Hawkeye playing against several Bob Knight teams there in the mid-90s. So all of that coming on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that, a quick word from this week's sponsor, and that is our friends at Home Field. And at homefield.com, homefieldapparel.com, you will find the comfiest and most unique licensed IU apparel that is available anywhere. Started by an IU grad, all Home Field apparel is designed and printed out of Indianapolis. And now that it's March, Home Field's got you covered for tournament season. Find your favorite vintage IU basketball apparel from Home Field and wear it proudly as IU survives and advances, hopefully beginning on Thursday. And of course, you can still get the Tri-Blend Fleece Bison hoodie. And you should do this. I just got this direct message in on Twitter, and I'm just going to read it to you. This is from a Twitter account, MMG. Met a random guy in Colorado who spotted my Home Field Hoosier Bowl sweatshirt from afar. Instantly made both the connection to Assembly Call podcast and, of course, Inside the Hall, Podcast on the Brink here. Appreciate the content. Go Hoosiers. I'm telling you, I was in Bloomington. I saw so many of those sweatshirts. I just guest hosted Crimson Cast last night. Scott was wearing the sweatshirt. On the last episode of the Assembly Call, Andy and Ryan were wearing their sweatshirts. If you don't have your fleece Tri-Blend sweatshirt with the Bison hoodie, go get it now. And don't forget to use the promo code BRINK at checkout for 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. Home Field, wear one for the team. And now, here's our conversation with Adam Jardy, followed by Jess Settles. We are joined now by Adam Jardy, who covers the Ohio State basketball team for the Columbus Dispatch. Adam, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. Good to have you back with us.
Thanks for lowering your standards and having me back.
No. We really enjoyed the first episode that we did with you this offseason talking about the Buckeyes. You gave great insight, and so that's why we wanted to take this opportunity to bring you back. And, you know, obviously these two teams played once this year, and back when Ohio State beat Indiana, the Buckeyes were 16-7, 6-6 in conference play, and firmly in the NCAA tournament. Since that game, Ohio State's gone 2-6. Included in there, obviously, are the 3 losses to end the season with Caleb Wesson out, and they now find themselves right there with Indiana on the bubble. What has changed for Ohio State since these two teams played several weeks ago?
One thing has changed, and one thing just became more and more pronounced. The thing that changed is Caleb Wesson being suspended. This is a team that in the offseason, Chris Holtmann talked about this recently, that you sit down and you figure out who on your team can demand a double team, and who on your team are teams going to have to game plan to take away and strategize how they're going to stop this guy. And so the really good teams have 3 of those guys. The elite teams might have 4. They realized in the offseason they had 1, and it was Caleb Wesson. So I don't know, 90% of what this team wants to do in one way or another sort of flows through him or involves him or plays off of him in some way. So when you lose him for 3 games, 2 of which are on the road and 1 of which is against a really good defensive Wisconsin team, that's just going to make life exceedingly difficult. And so that's been the big change. But as far as the rest of that stretch there, especially since the Indiana game, this team just could not hold on to the basketball for an extended period of time. They were in the mid 200s nationally in offensive turnover percentage. Really, when things started to, I don't want to say fall apart, but when they started to lose games at a rapid pace, it directly coincided with a stretch where they just could not stop. At times, literally handing the ball to the other team. And so those are the two things since Indiana that really stand out to me about where Ohio State is now.
With Wesson coming back, and obviously everybody expected that he would be back for the Big Ten tournament, that it would be a 3-game suspension. It's kind of what we assume this time of year when you see a guy get suspended. Yeah. Same thing with Devontae Green. With him coming back, do you expect him to be able to hit the ground running in the Big Ten tournament? You know, he's been a guy where conditioning has been an issue, foul trouble has been an issue. Those can be things that are affected by time away. How do you think that will affect him for this game Thursday?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think he'll come out pretty fired up, and I think for all things considered, I think this is a team that really, like, you could see this going the other way, where teams would not be thrilled. Oh, hey, you just got suspended and you might have just cost us the season. Like, thanks a lot. I think this team is genuinely excited to have him back. I think he's very well liked on the team, so I think he's going to fit in from that aspect. I don't think there's going to be any sort of ill will. The conditioning is certainly a question. That was an issue for him last year, especially down the stretch. When you look at the minutes that he played in his freshman season, it got harder for him, and they talked a lot about trying to keep on top of his conditioning. I know he's done a ton of extra running while he's been suspended. I'm sure that's not been an issue, but we all know that's not the same as game minutes. So I don't know if he's going to be rusty. I don't know if he's going to try to do too much and pick up too quick fouls. I don't know if he's going to play within himself and this team kicks into a gear that we haven't seen in a while and scores 70 points or something. I'm really not sure how this is going to impact them, other than they're obviously a much better team with him. That's about the only thing that I know going into this game. I think they'll play better than we've seen recently.
Adam, I thought one of the interesting wrinkles in the first matchup was Chris Holtmann and the Ohio State's coaching staff's decision to basically not even guard Justin Smith. And since that game, he's obviously had his, a career day against Michigan State. He had 24 points, and he's been playing a lot better recently. From a matchup standpoint, do you think Ohio State is going to approach this game any differently than they did the first time, just given how Indiana's been playing in recent weeks?
I think overall they probably have. I think there's probably a realization that this is an Indiana team that has found something here of late and is obviously playing. Just from a distance, it looks like they're playing harder. And maybe, I don't know if that's the only difference. I know they've got some guys that seem to be maybe healthier. But I think you have to take into account sort of the whole picture of a team at this point in the season. I don't think Ohio State will go into this game just specifically saying, okay, well, yeah, Justin Smith, we've got a game plan to take him away. I think Indiana presents a couple of options or a couple of issues for Ohio State offensively that I'm not sure quite how they grapple with. But when you think about a game where it was 55-52, and I mean, we all sat through it. We all saw the brutal shooting stretches at times on both sides. I would guess that if I'm Ohio State right now, like, yes, I'm worried about defensively, how are we going to stop Indiana? But so much of this team this season to me has been their offensive struggles that I think they're probably more concerned with how do we, I don't want to say outscore them, because it's not like we're going to see a 80-78 track meet or anything like that. But I think Ohio State will probably be a little bit more focused on trying to generate more consistent offense than maybe really, I would say, zeroing in on one specific player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I follow your Twitter, and I think you always have some interesting content after games in terms of just kind of breaking down different lineup combinations. And I'm curious, kind of, as Ohio State's gone through this slide, and obviously Wesson not being there is a big part of it, but if you had to point to another guy or two that really needs to play well for Ohio State to have success in Chicago, who maybe would be the top guy on your list for that?
Well, they really need Luther Muhammad to just sort of get back to close to the level that he was playing at for a while. I mean, this is a guy that I thought midway through the season was a shoo-in for all freshman team, and was really showing that he was an above average to possibly elite type of player. and he's really kind of fallen off here these last couple of games. I mean, the Indiana game, he had 9 points, and he's coming off a 20-point game against Penn State. He has not made more than one field goal in a game since then. And I mean, the numbers are, he's gone scoreless. He hasn't scored more than 4 points in a game. And so that's like their last, I think, 8 games. They need him to contribute more, just straight up. He's their third leading scorer. And this is, I mean, an extended slump, and it's kind of affected him at both ends. And so it's not just that he's not scoring too much, but he's a guy that they rely on to really help shut some guys down and frustrate some guys. I enjoyed seeing him at times matched up with Romeo Langford in the first matchup. I thought that was entertaining basketball. I was excited to see how that would play out. I don't know where he is with his game right now, other than it looks like his confidence is a little bit down. I think he's a little bit just worn down in general. But that's definitely a guy. I'm interested to see how C.J. Jackson and Keyshawn Woods, their primary, they're upperclassmen, they're ball handlers, how those guys build off of how they close at Wisconsin. CJ's been hurt. Keyshawn's been ineffective for long stretches of the season, but I think you saw some of the light switch flip where you realized that like the season is almost over and my career's almost over, and that really powered the late comeback against Wisconsin. So I'm interested to see how those guys maybe build off a performance like that, and if you see them playing with a little bit more aggression and a little bit of passion is the right word, but a little more aggression going forward here.
Yeah, speaking of C.J. Jackson, he's one of those guys now that will forever be hated by IU fans, considering that he has torpedoed our chances of beating Ohio State the last 2 times we've played them. I've been joking that if he gets the ball anywhere outside the 3-point line, a close game with under a minute, just tackle him. Don't let him shoot it. Just tackle him, because we know what's going in. Has he been a guy in other games outside of the Indiana games that has been kind of a clutch shooter? Is he kind of the guy on the perimeter that they really look to in big spots when they need someone to make a play on the perimeter?
Yeah, he's the closest thing they have to a last second guy, to a guy that they really want taking that shot at the buzzer. And a lot of times like that, it's just really hard to get the ball inside to a center. So it's not really Caleb Wesson. And so, against Wisconsin on Sunday, after they'd come from 22 down in the last 7 minutes and they have the ball with 6 seconds left. I mean, the play that they drew up was get the ball to CJ on the wing and let him make a play. And he saw his guy was kind of sagging off him a little bit, so he took a shot. And unlike when he's played Indiana, this one only found air. And so, they had some questions to answer about that after the game. But yeah, he's the closest thing they have to a guy that you would lean on or look to make a big shot down the stretch for sure.
How have Ohio State fans dealt with kind of the disappointment of how the Big Ten season has gone? From where Ohio State started 12-1 to where they are now. It's still the second year with Chris Holtmann. Obviously, he built a lot of goodwill last year with the surprising run that they had. Is this something where, fans have just kind of taken it and understood what's happened, or has there been, because we've certainly dealt with some things with Indiana, with, losing 12 out of 13 with, people getting, somewhat upset at Archie. How have the Ohio State fans dealt with that with Holtmann?
I was going to say, I think you've probably encountered some of the same experiences that I have this season, as far as engaging with the fan base in a season where expectations have not met the reality. I would counter that the expectations among the Ohio State fans have been based out of just sort of, I don't know if I want to say ignorance, but this was always going to be a team that was going to struggle. And I think that the fact that this is a team that is on the NCAA tournament bubble and playing for a chance to make the tournament, I think is arguably as good of a coaching job as Chris Holtmann did last season, because you're piecing it together on the fly with, a guy here and a guy there. And he has not been afforded the level of patience that I think he deserves from the Ohio State fan base this season. And I've been very surprised with how quickly some people have flipped and really been upset with this team and about the direction of the program. And it's like, you have to remind people that, I picked him 18-13 at the beginning of the season. So somehow I got that right. But this was always going to be a team that was going to struggle. This was always going to be a team that was, going to have a lot of things go well in order for them to have a chance in a lot of these games. And so, honestly, starting 12-1, you're never going to give back wins, or you're never going to try not to win. But I would bet that if you put Chris Holtmann up to a lie detector test, he'd probably tell you that he would starting 12-1 is probably the worst thing that they could do this season, because it just sort of it threw the expectations out of whack compared to what reality was. And I think that when you're dealing with a fan base like Ohio State and like Indiana, where the expectations are what they are, once fans think that the NCAA tournament is their birthright and a Final Four run is the expectation, that's when you kind of need to check yourself a little bit. And I don't think the Ohio State fan base has done a very good job of that this season.
Adam, you mentioned the tournament bubble, and obviously covering Ohio State and us covering IU, that's pretty much the topic at hand here for the next 5 or 6 days whenever the bracket comes out. I'm curious, kind of from your perspective as someone who's probably seen every Big Ten team now in person. There's been a lot of, I feel like, attacks from the national media on some of these teams, maybe closer to the middle to the bottom of the Big Ten, and when comparing them with some of these mid-major schools in terms of the bubble and how many teams the Big Ten should get in. I guess, where do you stand on teams in major conferences that go 8-12, 9-11 in terms of their being deserving of getting into the tournament?
Well, I guess two things. I think you have to take into account the quality of the league. And I think, we hear it, you guys know, we hear it every year at Big Ten Media Day. I've never seen a league this deep, and I think we're going to be as strong as we've ever been. And we had the Big Ten coaches teleconference on Monday, and every coach was like, this is the best league I've ever coached in. And you're always going to hear that. And it's such a cliche that I never, ever write it. But it is very clear that this is, if not the best team or the best league in the country, top two. You go from top to bottom and you look at who these teams are and how they've played at times during the season, and they're an 8-12 record or a 9-11 record in the Big Ten in another year would look very differently. Ohio State, they were 11-7 like 2-3 years ago, and they didn't make it because they didn't beat any. Those 11 wins were against 11 garbage teams. Nebraska last year, they don't get in. This is a very deep, challenging league this season, and I don't think that having a sub 500 conference record should preclude you from making the tournament. And I think it's always worth reminding people, because I hear local sports radio in Columbus talking about how you should look at the conference record and throw them out immediately. That's not even on the team sheet. It's literally not a talking point in the selection committee. So it's easy to sort of yell about that, but I don't think that's really a thing. My counter to all this is that Division I basketball should not have 351 or 353 teams. I think it's ludicrous that we're sitting here and we're comparing, a Belmont with an Indiana or an Ohio State. It's not to downplay those teams, and I don't want to take away the magic that is March Madness, but to try to hold these teams to an equal standard when, a team like Belmont doesn't have the same opportunities that Ohio State does, or Indiana does, or, pick a major team. We're not dealing with apples to apples here. And so, yes, I'd love to see, as many mid-major teams as you can, get in there and get an opportunity. That's what we all love about the tournament. But do we really know that team is better than the middling team in the best team or the best conference in the country? I don't know. And that's why I do think there's too many teams in Division I basketball. That's sort of my long-winded answer to that.
Oh, there's so many mainstream media voices. They're going to be angrily shaking their fists at listening to that part of the show. But I think you make some really good points, though. Some really good points. It does make those conversations kind of difficult and kind of complicated, this time of year. So, but unfortunately, that is where we are. Adam, one final question for you about, a player on Ohio State's team, because, a lot of times in tournament play, you can have a game swung by, an unexpected performance by a guy coming off the bench that gets hot. And Indiana has really been burned at times this year. The Northwestern game when Aaron Falzone goes nuts. The Minnesota game, Gabe Kalsher is, a much more well-known player and had been better, but, he gets hot and goes nuts. So I'm looking down at, some of the recent performances by Ohio State players, and you see Justin Arns in that 6 for 10 against Iowa, which you don't want to put too much stock into because Iowa doesn't play any defense. But he's also had 2 games out of the last 5 where he's made 3. And, he now, he played 1 minute against Indiana. He's played at least 20 in the last 5 games. What do you project his role to be? And will it change at all with Caleb Wesson back? And is he the kind of guy that could be an X factor in a game like this?
Yeah, he certainly could be. And that's a real good some real good analysis right there, because that's a guy that they've always known that they're confident in him as a shooter and that he's confident as a shooter. But his defense has held him back for much of the season. But they hit a point, and it was obviously like right before that Iowa game. At Maryland, he played 27 minutes and he had 9 points there. The game before that, where they realized that they needed somebody who was going to make some buckets. And when the offense was trending in a very, very negative direction, he sparked them. The Indiana the Iowa performance where he scores 29 points out of nowhere. I mean, I did some research. I don't know that there's ever been a performance comparable to that in Ohio State basketball history, where a guy who had done so little for so long in a season does something like that so late. I mean, to come out of nowhere, that's as many points as Greg Oden ever scored in a game in his Ohio State career. And
Romeo Langford's never scored that many points.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Watching that happen was surreal. And so I think what you see when you watch Justin now, the next game Purdue completely took him out of the game. He only got one shot. But you can see when he shoots, he thinks it's going in, and it looks like he's going in. He's in good form right now. His shot looks really good, and his teammates are looking for him. He's earned a spot in the starting lineup at the expense of some guys who are very offensively challenged. So, I do think he's a guy. If he hits 3 threes against Indiana on Thursday, I really like Ohio State's chances to advance.
Well, memo to the Hoosiers: make sure you know your scouting report. Do not leave him, because he's shooting 40.4%, and as you said, he can get red hot. So we don't want to have that experience again. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Really looking forward to this game Thursday. It's a huge game for both teams, so I would really expect two teams that just go all out for 40 minutes, and hopefully it's a more aesthetically pleasing game than the one that we saw in Bloomington, but it should definitely be an intense one.
Yeah, no, when you got two teams that are playing for their lives, this feels like a play-in game to possibly the play-in game in the tournament. So, I'm expecting this should be one of the most contested and hopefully one of the best games of the Big Ten tournament. I'm very excited to see how this one goes.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you, Adam. We look forward to talking with you again in the future.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
All right, our thanks to Adam Jardy for joining us. Coming up next, our conversation with Jess Settles. But before we get to that, a quick word from this week's other sponsor, SeatGeek. As you know, getting tickets online can be far too complicated. With hundreds of sites and varying levels of reliability, it's hard to know who to trust, but that's why SeatGeek is the way to go. SeatGeek pulls millions of tickets into one place so that you can easily find the seats you want for a price you're willing to pay. There's nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for great value. Right now, SeatGeek has great prices for the Big Ten tournament. If you go there, go to the IU basketball page. You can buy your session tournaments for the Big Ten tournament in Chicago, and then, of course, keep that site bookmarked, have the app on your phone, because hopefully Indiana will be playing in the tournament. Hopefully it's the NCAA tournament. Still, obviously, could potentially be the NIT tournament, but you'll need to have SeatGeek on a speed dial of sorts so that you can get tickets ASAP once Indiana's tournament assignment is announced. And SeatGeek is the place that you should go because they make the ticket buying experience easier than ever. By searching multiple ticket sites and grading every ticket based on value, SeatGeek helps you immediately identify the best seats that fit your budget. Plus, every purchase is fully guaranteed, so you can shop for tickets on SeatGeek with confidence. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. It's the easiest way I've found to shop for tickets. I use it for sports tickets, for concert tickets, any type of live event. SeatGeek is the place that I'm going to get tickets, and that's why I recommend that you do the same. And here's the best part. Since you listen to Podcast on the Brink, you get $10 off your first purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK today. That's promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, for $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. SeatGeek, life's an event. We have the tickets. And now our conversation with Jess Settles. And we are joined now on Podcast on the Brink by the great Jess Settles, Iowa basketball legend and BTN college basketball analyst. Jess, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks so much, Alex and Jerod. I really appreciate being on. I told you before, I really enjoy the website and all the work that you guys do and the breakdowns, especially that you put together. So I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. So you were there Sunday for Indiana's win over Rutgers, one of the better Indiana performances of the season and a big senior day spectacle from Juwan Morgan. What were your biggest takeaways from watching Indiana play in person?
Well, I just love the way J-Mo attacked early in that game. I mean, he just has to continue to do that. He's one of the most versatile players in the league and can use both hands. I just loved his intensity. The turnovers stood out once again. I mean, for the Indiana backcourt to go to Illinois and not even have a turnover is just remarkable. It's probably never happened in the history of a team playing against a Brad Underwood defense. And then you come back against a rugged Rutgers team, a team that's very physical, likes to grab, likes to scrap, and to handle the ball the way they did against them as well. It's just a great sign going forward. So it's been a wonderful stretch for Indiana, and for them to be able to handle the ball like that over the last two games it was just outstanding.
Now, you were there earlier in the season. I think you called the Indiana game against Jacksonville. What were some of the biggest changes that you've seen from Indiana from then until now? And, obviously that was a long time ago, so maybe even just some of the changes that you've seen over the past 3 or 4 weeks as Indiana has started to play better basketball.
Well, the first game against Jacksonville that I called, J-Mo had a triple-double. So both games that I've watched him play have probably been 2 of the better games of his career. So I was teasing him about that. Like, I need to call all of your games. And
yeah,
he was.
Can you call all the Big Ten tournament games, please?
Right. I mean, I think he looks over and says, "Hey, I've got to play well for Jess." But it's that didn't change at all. Phinisee didn't play the first time that I watched him, but I studied a lot of tape going into that game, and I had no idea he would be out that long, let alone affected so much when he came back. So it just looks to me like he's been healthy for about 4 or 5 games at the most down the stretch. And when he's on the court, they're a completely different team, especially defensively. I mean, he is just so good at controlling the ball and staying in front of his defender. He had so many great defensive possessions against Geo Baker. It just seemed like he toyed with Frazier the other night in the Illinois game at both ends of the court. So that was fun to see. So they're finally healthy. Smith has responded extremely well to the benching at Iowa, and they have their confidence back. So it's really a team that just went through so much adversity. And is it too little, too late? I hope not. But they look like one of the better teams in the league over the last couple of weeks.
Jess, we had a chance to talk Saturday night before the game, and I think one of the things we discussed was just the matchup in general with Rutgers, and I think you agreed with me that it wasn't a particularly great matchup for Indiana just based on their size and their physicality. Were you surprised at how easily Indiana handled Rutgers on Sunday?
I was, because I think I was telling you the other night on the phone, I sat courtside a few games ago in Iowa City when they came in and just took Iowa to the woodshed. I mean, in every phase of the game, they were great. And that night, they were actually even knocking down threes. I think they had maybe 10 threes against the Hawkeyes. So that was a little bit of a concern. But they rebound as well at the offensive end as anybody in the country, let alone in the Big Ten. I mean, I believe they're ranked number 1 in offensive rebounding in the league. And so that was the story the first time Indiana played them. They just kept flying in there, kept dunking it, getting extra possessions, second chance points. Right from the beginning of the game, Indiana controlled the boards. And I think they were actually up 10-2 going into maybe the second or third timeout with a rebounding advantage. That was just huge. Now, J-Mo was phenomenal on the glass at both ends, and that made a big deal. That made it give them a great start. But then, Rutgers doesn't stop. I mean, they keep coming, and they ended up winning the glass, but by the time the game got out of hand, that wasn't as big of a factor. But that was just big. I mean, Indiana has to play tough. They have to rebound. They won all the 50-50 balls, and they basically did to Rutgers what Rutgers is used to doing to everybody else in the league on a given basis.
I thought maybe one of the underrated things about that game too, a lot's been talked about. Juwan Morgan, obviously Devontae Green had a good game. Rob Phinisee continues to play well. Romeo Langford, 20 points. And it may have been the most quiet 20-point game I can remember a guy having. I'm just curious from a guy who's played at this level. Obviously, you've watched the Big Ten for a long time. In terms of freshmen that have come through this league, how impressed have you been by Romeo? And I guess maybe where have you seen him grow over his freshman season?
I've been very impressed. I love watching him play. It's so fun to sit courtside and watch him play. He's so long. When he goes to the basket, especially with his right hand, he's almost unstoppable. A great vertical. He has a great attitude on the court. I talked to Archie at practice the night before, and Archie just talked about how much he loved coaching him, how much the guys loved being around him. He's a pretty quiet kid, but he's been asked to do so much this year. He's still young, and I know he's a great player, but to carry the burden that he's carried in being an Indiana high school legend, it's something that nobody who hasn't gone through it could really understand it. And then to come in and to fit in as well as he has been great. He's a good defensive player, so it's not like he takes those possessions off. But with all the injuries and the suspension to Green and all the bad things that have happened to Indiana, that just seems like it would be overwhelming to a kid who's supposed to carry a team on a nightly basis. And he's done a pretty good job. The close losses to Iowa, to Ohio State, those really damage the confidence of that team. And then, people become more critical of him. But I didn't even realize he had 20 in that game. That's how quiet it was. I'm surprised to hear you say that. It just felt like it was a 10-point game, and he did his job, and they got the victory.
Jess, you mentioned some of the injuries that Indiana has dealt with this year. One of those injuries has been to Deron Davis. And, a number that I uncovered recently that I found really interesting is that when Deron plays 5 or more minutes, Indiana is 16-7. When he plays 4 or fewer minutes, the Hoosiers are 1-7. And, you don't often look at a guy who, plays 19 minutes a game, comes off the bench and think, man, his absence is just killer for this team. And obviously there was other stuff involved in it too. But when you see a number like that, do you think that's just kind of more, kind of a random statistic, or what do you see in Deron's impact that would lead him, even playing less than half of a game, to have such a huge impact on the team when he's on the court?
Like every successful Big Ten team over the years has had to have a junkyard dog, and somebody who's tough, somebody with a winning mentality, someone who likes to fight and claw, and he's that guy for Indiana. So his productivity doesn't show up a lot of nights on the stat sheet, but it does in the winning column, and you just back that up, and he has to have those minutes. But when I was there for the Jacksonville game, and he was just trying to get back into shape, Tim Garl was working with him, I believe, in the pool, because his foot and his Achilles were so bad you can't get in shape on the court. And now you fast forward to this time of the year, he got a good technical foul at Illinois, I believe, which I really liked. I mean, you got to step up and fight in these games, and sometimes that's necessary. He was barking a little bit, maybe with Georgie. And then the other night at practice, Archie was into practice the other night. I mean, he was flying all over the court, almost lost his voice. I mean, there was a sense of desperation in that gym. Obviously, they could not lose to Rutgers. So there were a lot of competitive scenarios going on, a lot of scorekeeping on the drills. And Davis, he even in practice, he wasn't happy with one of the assistant coaches for how they were scoring it. And so he was barking at guys and making it more competitive and bringing edge to practice, which is what I like. I mean, this is the Big Ten. So he being on the court is huge, because he'll use all 5 of his fouls. He'll fight. And then the little fadeaway jumper he had against Rutgers, boy, that was a big shot in that first half. Now Archie has a bench. Everybody's healthy. They can sustain those fouls that they had to go through. And he's a big reason why. I just love his game. I mean, I'm rambling about him, but he's a tough guy.
So I want to go back to your playing career for a second, because I think you had an experience that, may be instructive in terms of, what Indiana has gone through this year. I mean, you played on a lot of good Iowa teams. You won, your teams the last 4 years that you were there, won 20 games. Your freshman year, you guys were 11-16, 5-13 in the conference, and you went through a stretch late in Big Ten play where I think you lost 8 out of 9 or 9 out of 10. Included in there was, a tough loss at Indiana, against a really good Indiana team. It was 93-91, a tough loss for a young team on the road. How did you guys handle so many losses without a lot of wins? And then, how were you able to kind of overcome that? Because that came toward the end of the season, and use it, as a springboard, if that is how you used it, to the success that you were able to have thereafter.
I think a lot of Hoosier fans will remember that was the year following the Chris Street tragedy.
Yeah.
And so Iowa had a darn good year, going before Chris's accident. They had AC Earl, Val Barnes. That was an NCAA tournament team, Wade Lookingbill. So when we came in as a freshman, Chris Kingsbury, the Mad Bomber, and I came in, Kevin Smith, who was a squirrely little guard, who was a great guard, was suspended, and so he was off the team. So all of a sudden, we just didn't have much to work with. I remember sitting in Dr. Tom's office a few days before the start of the season that year, and he's like, you two are going to have to play heavy minutes. I mean, I don't typically want to play freshmen tons of minutes, but we just don't have anybody else. So going into that year, I mean, we would fight people, and we would do anything it took to win, but we weren't great. And so the losses continued to mount up. I didn't realize the game at Indiana was that close. I remember it being a great battle. I think Brian Evans and I went face to face in that game a couple times. He was a warrior and a great player. So that was back when you could shove somebody or get in somebody's face and they didn't go to the monitor for 20 minutes to see if somebody hurt somebody else's feelings. But they had a tough team and a tournament team, but the losses didn't seem to affect us as much because the expectations weren't that high. Now, ironically, the following year, we had a very nice team. We had Andre Woolridge transferred in from Nebraska. He ended up a few years later being a first-team All-American, led the league in scoring and assists. I think second time it only had ever happened. The first one was Magic Johnson. But I was injured mid that year when we went on a losing streak. And, the mentality is that you have to have other people step up. And like Indiana this year, when you don't have much depth, things can get out of hand quickly. And if I remember correctly, we came into Assembly Hall that year on senior day, and back on those senior days with Bob Knight, I don't know if they ever lost a senior day, but we were one game above 500, if I remember correctly, and no one had never been not invited to the NCAA tournament out of the Big Ten who wasn't 500. I'm pretty sure that was the case. Indiana just absolutely blew us off the court that day. I think Alan Henderson, he felt like he had 50. He was just tip dunking on us. We ended up 500 and not getting in the NCAA tournament. So that was just a devastating blow for us. But injuries, suspensions can derail a season so quickly. The seasons are so fragile. And so you kind of feel for what these guys have gone through for the Hoosiers this year.
Jess, I know you're going to be in Chicago for the Big Ten tournament. What are you looking forward to most? This feels like there's a lot of storylines going in, especially with the three Big Ten teams, Minnesota, Ohio State, Indiana. I think Minnesota at this point safely in, but Ohio State, Indiana have some work to do, obviously, to kind of get themselves into the NCAA tournament. And obviously, there's some other things going on in terms of just kind of who advances to the weekend and who ultimately wins the tournament. What are you looking forward to most about the Big Ten tournament this week?
Just how competitive it will be. Is how unique it is this year with all the teams at the bottom being so good and now playing so well. I mean, the Indiana-Ohio State matchup is fascinating. Looks like Wesson will be back. I mean, you got to imagine he's going to be hungry. So that's really a toss-up to me. Maryland seems like they've probably received the best draw. I mean, it looks like, let's just say they're going to play Rutgers, and then I don't think anybody on Maryland would be afraid of Wisconsin. Penn State is playing as well as anybody in the conference. That's going to be a heck of a battle with Minnesota. I think Penn State feels like they can beat Purdue as well in that next game. And then Iowa and Illinois both feel like they could give Michigan a game. So I don't know, where are you guys on the tournament? I mean, I feel like Indiana, to feel comfortable, would probably have to win 2 games, but I think they're probably glad that they get a possible shot at Michigan State if it worked out. I mean, that's what they want. They want a tough game like that, a marquee game like that.
Yeah, that seems to be what the bracketologists say is, you win 2 and you can feel pretty good. And obviously it depends on what happens around you on the bubble. But it does feel like this Indiana-Ohio State game maybe isn't so much a play-in game, but could be something of a play-out game, where the loser is really going to make life tough on themselves. And, Indiana fans are scarred by so many disappointments in the Big Ten tournament in the past. So we never want to look past the first game because you're always one last-second shot away from that ending in disappointment. So we just want to get this first win and think about the rest after that.
That's well said. I think we're the same way, right? I mean, it's just, you spend a lot of money, you get the hotels, you go up there, you lose a game, you should win, and it's just a bitter feeling. I know the feeling.
Speaking of the Hawkeyes, they've obviously been going through some struggles of late. Do you see any chance for them to kind of get things turned around and get their ship righted? Because they were playing really well there for a little while.
Yeah, it's remarkable how we talk about player suspensions this year and how that's impacted the league. I mean, I don't think Indiana's in the situation they're in if Devontae Green wasn't suspended for those 3 or 4 games. With everything else falling apart, I think they win a few of those games. And look at what's happened to Ohio State with Caleb Wesson. I mean, Rutgers just lost their guy who was playing well for the Indiana game. And then maybe the most impactful suspension down the stretch has been Fran McCaffrey at Iowa. You know, Hawkeyes have had a very good year, but they were setting themselves up for a pretty high seed a week and a half ago. He gets suspended, and they just get run by Rutgers and didn't really even show up for the game at Wisconsin. They played a lot better at Nebraska, but Nebraska obviously doesn't have much right now. But that was a good sign for Iowa going into the tournament. But they're obviously reeling. I mean, they have forgotten how to win, and that's no easy challenge if they have to play Illinois in that Thursday game. So I don't have a clue what Iowa team we're going to see. It's really been tough, and we'll see if they can recover from that.
Jess, I want to ask you just a philosophical question from your perspective. As somebody that's obviously going to talk about this stuff, probably a lot coming up on TV the next few days. There's going to be a lot of talk, I feel like, and there already has been from the national media about quote unquote mediocre major conference teams getting in the tournament with sub 500 conference records, and there's already kind of some talk that maybe some of these teams shouldn't get in favor of some mid majors that maybe had better overall seasons in terms of wins and losses. Where do you kind of stand on teams like Indiana, Ohio State, and maybe a team like Texas from these other leagues that have played a lot of really high quality games and maybe have only won, 55% of them? Do you think that they deserve consideration for the tournament, or do you think that maybe some of these other mid-majors should have a chance to get in?
It's always a tough dilemma. It depends on what camp you are in. I think those of us who cover the Big Ten, you guys obviously know, the majority of those mid-major teams wouldn't be 500 in the Big Ten this year. And so then it comes down to, does that really matter? Well, I was looking at the kind of the bylaws with JD the other night, and it seems like it's very clear that they're trying to take the best at-large teams, not the most deserving. So, I mean, that obviously gets a little gray as well. But I think right now, Indiana is one of the best teams to be chosen for an at-large bid, obviously depending on if there are any bid thieves over these conference tournaments and things like that. But the other thing I've never been able to figure out with the committee is, what the Phinisee factor with the injury there. I mean, obviously, if Phinisee doesn't get injured, we don't even have this discussion at all. I think Indiana finishes easily in the upper half. So I want to see the best teams. I'm a big fan of having the power conference guys in. If we want to expand the tournament, I really don't have a problem with that. Get more of these mid-major teams in there and some of these teams that are maybe deserving. I'd also I wish, I don't know what you think of this, but I wish they'd come out with Selection Sunday before the tournaments to see who the committee actually has in and what needs to be done, and then have another one on the True Selection Sunday. Because they say every game is equally important from the beginning to the end, but is it really? We're going to find out this weekend. I mean, what are your thoughts on all that?
Boy, that would be interesting. Part of the allure, I guess, and the frustration of the entire process is that, we kind of get some guidelines, and they've allowed some folks in for kind of the mock bracketology selections to see how it goes, but we don't really know where things sit right now. Like, they could be thinking about Indiana as a 10 seed right now, or Indiana could be totally off, and we have, really no idea. And so it is challenging. It has to be challenging for coaches, I would think, to try to, to figure that out. And probably, the smart coaches, you put together the best schedule you can. You try and figure out, what the criteria is so that you can best put your team in position to take advantage of it. But then you just got to go win games, I guess. But it would be nice to have the curtain pulled back a little bit and feel like you had a better idea of what is really being looked at. Because I feel like some of the discussions we end up having, people end up shouting over each other, talking about criteria that's important to them. It's like, yeah, but what's important to the committee? That's what we're all trying to guess. And that's what can make it a little frustrating.
Yeah, I'd like to see them at least take it a bit further with when they do the initial reveal of the top 4 seeds in each bracket, why not just go ahead and give us the whole bracket in their committee's eyes at that point? I think actually if they did something like at least like a weekly bracket reveal of where things stood, it would actually maybe create even more excitement, because then you'd have teams that were maybe right off the cut line saying that we have to absolutely win this game or we're not going to be in, because we know that they meet over the course of the season and discuss a lot of these things. So I think anything you can do to increase the interest in the sport, and I think a lot of times college basketball, not so much in the Big Ten, but because there's fans that follow it year round, and that allows guys like Jerod and I to do our jobs. But around the country, college basketball, there's people that just pop in for March. So anything I think you can do to bring more fans, more casual fans in, and giving them a glimpse at what's going to actually be in front of them in March, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if there's ever been a year for it, I mean, this is such a unique year because there are so many teams on the bubble, and the Pac-12 is so down. And so there are so many unique opportunities. And this is one of those seasons where a team with 14, 15, maybe 16 losses can actually get in and it be the right choice. So we'll see how it plays out. But I would sure like to know going into this tournament where Indiana stands and what the committee thinks of them. And hopefully, the name on the jersey won't hurt them, because it's going to be a very complicated decision if they beat Ohio State and then lose to Michigan State. I mean, it's really going to be the topic of conversation on all the shows, I think.
Yep. Well, Jess, to close here, I want to go back to your playing career and ask you a couple questions about that. One is kind of reflecting on the Big Ten tournament. You're one of the few players that went from not having a Big Ten tournament your first couple years to then the Big Ten tournament started your last couple years. And I know that you guys didn't have success in the Big Ten tournament, but which did you prefer when the Big Ten tournament came in? Did you like it? Do you think the Big Ten tournament is a good thing, or do you like how things were before without the tournament?
I love the Big Ten tournament. I think it keeps hope alive, gives so many of these teams who have struggled with injuries or maybe a suspension or just a terrible losing streak a chance to redeem themselves. And like we talked about before, my freshman year, we actually were playing pretty well down the stretch of that regular season. I don't think we would have won the tournament, but I think we could have won a couple of games. Sophomore year, it would have just been critical for us to have the Big Ten tournament, to go there, win a game, and get in the NCAA tournament. So Dr. Tom Davis, my coach, was a big advocate for it for years. Jim Delaney has wanted it for years because he grew up in, I believe, an ACC country, and they've been having one for decades, and he saw what that would do for a conference and a state. Bob Knight was probably the biggest roadblock to it. He did not want it, and I don't think Gene Cady wanted it, or Jed Heathcote. So there was a lot of back and forth there to finally get it. But I was only able to play in one of them in 1999. We lost that, but it was a wonderful experience and a great opportunity. And, I mean, just think about Indiana basketball this year. If they didn't have it, I mean, the season would be over. So it's just a great thing. I think you guys would agree with that. Great for the fans, great for the media. The coaches, the players love it. And it's really been a wonderful thing for all of us who love the game.
Thinking about you as a player, and, I think, people old enough like me, to remember, watching you play, there are probably some younger people listening that maybe don't, but, there are players that, you kind of love to hate because they just, they would beat your team and you just hated them. And then there were players that you kind of hate to love, where it's like, man, the way that guy plays, like he's an opponent and I should dislike him, but I just really appreciate how that guy plays. And I feel like, to me, you always fit that category for IU fans because of the way you played, how hard you played, how versatile you were. And, looking at your career and looking at your numbers, it's really interesting how close they are to Juwan Morgan's numbers, and some of the similarities between you guys as players. And I'm just curious, something that you did, you were a pretty good 3-point shooter back in the day. And I'm curious how you think your game would have translated and how things would have been different if you had played in today's Big Ten as opposed to back then.
I think I would have had a hard time staying on the court with all of these grab and hold and touch fouls. I would have had to definitely adjust that. I mean, we did not, those of us who played power forward back in the day on all the teams, we didn't really worry about fouling out much. I mean, there just weren't a lot of times where you had four or five fouls in a game because it was so much more physical. The pick and pop game, I think, would have suited me well. I'm surprised that we didn't come up with that sooner, but we had some good guards. and just this pick and roll action. If you can set a hard screen, roll to the basket and finish, and then also step out and shoot it at a decent percentage, there's a place for you in today's game. But I grew up loving Indiana basketball, watching those legendary teams, studying a lot of those players. Our family came to the Indianapolis 500 every year. My aunt and uncle lived in Indianapolis. My Aunt Barb was one of the first full scholarship players to ever play women's basketball at Indiana University. So you grew up watching the league and studying those teams and those rugged teams and those physical power forwards. And it's just the only thing that most of us knew on a lot of the teams. So it was definitely an honor to play against those guys. And I think my game would have transferred okay to this era.
Well, Jess, this has been wonderful. I feel like we kind of only scratched the surface on the stuff that we talk about. So hopefully we can have you on the show again in the future. And I will say the Indiana fan base is one that tends to be very critical of announcers. And I probably saw more positive comments about your work for the Rutgers game than almost any other announcer that we had this year. So I hope that we'll get to hear you do more games because I thought you did a really good job. And so we appreciate that. And we appreciate you joining us here on Podcast on the Brink.
Oh, I really appreciate being on. Just a great show, a great website, and I really appreciate the positive comments from the Hoosier faithful. It's really an honor for me to call those games, an honor to play there. It's obviously my favorite arena. I've never made any secrets about that, and I love Indiana basketball, and that's probably hard for people from other Big Ten schools to understand. But if you follow the Hoosiers over your lifetime and been in that gym, it just does something to you, and you guys are doing a great job. I'll see you at the Big Ten tournament. Look forward to it.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks, Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.